Welcome back to our discussion of operations management topics. Today we will focus on resource planning, which is chapter 15 in operations management area. And in today's lecture, we'll look into the concepts of material requirement planning within the resource planning area. Also, later on discuss capacity requirement planning, enterprise resource planning, and then how that relates to customer relationship management, supply chain management, and product lifecycle management. So those are some of the areas that we look within the resource planning topic. In terms of resource planning for manufacturing, you can see based on the forecast and the customer orders, we end up creating the aggregate production plan that has been discussed in the previous lectures. And if it is not feasible, that has to be revised to the point where it becomes feasible on the product family at the aggregate level. And once it's feasible, that's when using the input from forecast and customer orders, master production schedule has to be created. And then we can create material requirement planning plans, which are intermediate plans, as well as that goes on to revise and update capacity requirement planning as to what type of machines and resources needed to deliver the necessary, cater to the necessary demand that we have. And then once it's feasible, until it's feasible, that master production schedule has to be revised, which will revise MRP as well as CRP. And then once it's feasible, that's when the purchase orders and work orders are created, which will impact our inventory and shop floor control issues. That will be addressed in the later chapters. And then manufacturing can begin. In terms of material requirement planning, it is a computerized inventory control and production planning system. And why use MRP? It is used for dependent demand items, which typically are the parts or sub-assemblies that are needed to produce the actual products that are demanded by the customers. These are discrete demand items. If we are making coffee and 16-ounce coffee, it doesn't, one cannot distinguish between 16 ounces and 16.001 ounces. So that's more of a continuous items, whereas number of computers could be 1 or 2, it cannot be 1.1. So that's the discrete nature of certain products. And MRP works well for discrete products which can be counted, 1, 2, 3, rather than something that can be measured like a cup of coffee is 16 ounces or 16.1 ounces, etc. So it is used for complex products, because for simple products you don't need a sophisticated MRP system. One can easily do things by hand. And it typically is for job shop environment where the product variety is more and the quantity used is less. For continuous production, you don't need MRP because things do not change that much in terms of the composition of various parts in the product itself, and it is for assemble to order environment. So example of this, if you think of independent demand is for the final table, the dining table that you look at, and that is being dictated by the customer. Customers will go to a furniture shop and request a particular table, whereas the actual, the surface of the table as well as the legs of the table, those are being, they are dependent demand items. These depend on the number of tables that are we have decided to make. So if we decided to make 10 tables, we need 10 surfaces plus 10 times 4, 40 table legs. If we decide to make 100 tables, as is indicated in this figure, then you need 100 tabletops, 1 tabletop for each table, plus the 400 table legs, 4 table legs for each table. So that's where the discrete nature comes in. And just to indicate that, in this case, you can see materials with independent demand, which we discussed in the chapter on inventory management. This is where demand is coming from company customers, whereas what we are covering in this chapter, MRP, the dependent demand items are decided by the parent item. There's like the table, the demand for tables will decide how many table tops and as well as how many table legs will be needed. Material type is finished goods. Over here, the company customers are always interested in the finished good, whereas in this case, the type of material that dependent demand items are dealing with are the work in process or raw material. So how many table legs are needed in this case, etc. Methods for estimating demand in this case are forecast and customer order book in terms of what will be the estimate for the final demand from customers. Whereas over here, these are just strict calculations based on the number of final finished goods that are needed. You're calculating how many parts are needed to make those finished goods. The planning method, as I mentioned, which was discussed in inventory management chapter, it's economic order quantity, EOQ, or reorder point, how much to order and when to order. Whereas in this case, we plan using MRP. So that's the difference that you see. And in this case, the overview, basically, we have the authorized master production schedule and other sources of demand. So for example, the table that we mentioned in the previous example, so you have an authorized master production schedule, which is 100 tables are needed, so we know we need 100 tabletops and 400 table legs, as was mentioned in the previous example. But there could be other sources of demand. For example, some customer may have already purchased the table, and one of the legs needs to be replaced because of unevenness or broken or whatever reason. And that's where the demand for spare parts may be coming in, which is the other source. And from here, one looks into how many inventory transactions you have, how much source of, how much information, various parts and sub-assemblies are sitting in the warehouse. Maybe you already had created tabletops in the past and they are sitting in the warehouse that has not been assembled together to make final goods yet. So based on the inventory records, that information will go in here. Also based on what the design of the product is. Currently the design of the product indicates that each table contains one tabletop and 4 legs. But if we decide to change the design to make the newer design of the table to have only 3 legs or 5 legs, that will has to be reflected. That change has to be reflected in the bill of material. That is, the new revised table now requires 3 legs per table or 5 legs per table, as in contrast to the 4 legs in the traditional model. So once we incorporate all that, we actually do the calculations in MRP, and out comes the material requirement planning plan. Now, in terms of, in this case, so what we end up using is you get the demand from master production schedule as to what needs to be produced. Product structure file, which is, again, the bill of material, gives you the information, as well as item master file in terms of inventory record. Is you create the MRP, material requirement plan, which will indicate when to release order for what type of assembly to create that finished good. That's where specific work orders will be released, purchase orders for any raw material, and rescheduling notice if we need to move up production of something, certain aspect, preempt something else in the assembly order of things to make sure the right product is delivered at the right time. MRP inputs and outputs. Inputs are, as we mentioned in the previous example, we have the master production schedule, product structure tree, and item master file. If you see the previous example, those are the 3 inputs going into MRP. And the outputs are indicated over here, which are the planned order releases which result in work order, purchase order, and scheduling order. Now, in terms of master production schedule, it's an extension of aggregate plan that was covered in the previous chapter. And it specifies production exactly in the following items. What, in terms of specific end items, finished goods that you are looking at, when are they needed in terms of weeks, days, or even hours, and how much. So once that mystery is solved as to what, when, and how much of a variety of goods are needed, from aggregate plan, which is basically taking care of product families or groups, come up master production schedule, which is looking at specific end items, as was discussed in the previous chapter. So in this case, master production schedule drives MRP process with a schedule of finished products. Quantities represent production, not demand. And in this case, quantities may consist of combination of customer order and the demand forecast that we mentioned. If you recall our discussion in the previous chapter on available to promise or capability to promise. So that's the actual production, not demand forecast. And then quantity represent what needs to be produced, not what can be produced. It represents an item that may or may not be finished products. In this particular case, you can see product structure file depends on whether the master schedule is focusing on the finished goods, which is typically for make-to-stock environments, where items are being produced in anticipation for goods and services that will be desired by customers. So we produce the goods that will go on the shelf, store shelf, and in anticipation of future demand. Whereas assemble to order will be example of products that are typically computer laptops that are purchased in today's day and age, which typically are assembled as soon as order comes in and customized to the needs of a particular customer. And then finally, make to order, which are strictly created after. So in this case, every single thing that is needed for this product is initiated after. The entire production process is initiated after the customer order is received. So this is make to order. So over here, master schedule components or materials is focused on. Whereas over here, you take the raw material, create sub-assemblies or modules, and then you wait for the final demand and then assemble that product to order. So looking at it in more specifically, in the make to order, this is a process focus, and we are looking at, you typically focus on scheduling the orders over here. Print shop, machine shop, fine dining, restaurants, all are examples of process focus, which typically produce their goods in make to order environment. Whereas in terms of assemble to order or forecast, those are repetitive environment. As I mentioned, motorcycles, automobiles, TVs, fast food restaurants, computer industry, those will be all examples. This is where we try to end up creating work in process schedule. And then stock to forecast, which is make to stock. That's a product focus. Steel, bread, beer, beverages, light bulbs, paper, all those will be example of those make to stock environment. Now, depending on this information, there are concept of time fences. So the demand time fence, which is no schedule changes allowed when this within this time fence, this is referred to as frozen. And the time fences example is given over here. So this is the frozen part that is from now till 8 weeks from now, there's almost no changes allowed in the production is already put in place, and very little changes in flexibility in capacity is available. So these are all based on firm customer orders. But the further down in the future we go, there is some flexibility that is still available. So the firm customer orders will decrease, but forecasted and available capacity, recall our discussion of capability to promise or availability available to promise. That's the top portion right here. And the more flexibility is available, the further down in the future you go. So in that case, you look into time fences, the next two fences that we mentioned, these allow for some changes, and those can be divided into two parts: moderately firm, which is the middle one that, as I mentioned right here. And in this particular case, changes allowed within product groups as long as parts are available. And then the last one is flexible, significant variation allowed as long as overall capacity requirements remain at the same level. So in this particular case, let's take an example of a master production schedule. You have example of a product clipboard, and in this case, you're looking at stationary goods industry. You have pencil cases. Master production schedule is given to be 125 units that need to be produced every period. Clipboards have to be 85, 95, 120, and then 100 for the period 4 and 5. Lap boards could be 75, 120, 47, different numbers, and lap desk is also 50 units every other week. So in that case, you can see the clipboard is, if you just focus on the clipboard itself, it's made up of several components. This is a finished clipboard, and that's made up of the back, which is the press board, 1 unit of that. Then you need a top clip, 1 unit of that. The pivot, in which holds the spring. Bottom clip, each one of these is 1 unit each, and then 2 rivets which hold the pivot together, the spring within the pivot together. So given this information, one can easily look into product structure tree or bill of material. You can see clipboard, which is level 0, which is the highest level or the level of finished good. In order to make a clipboard, you need 1 press board, 1 clip assembly, and 2 rivets. Now, the clip assembly is made up of a top clip, bottom clip, pivot, and spring. So that's a level 2. So in terms of planning, we start with the finished good, then go to sub-assemblies, then go to the basic materials. But in terms of actual production, we start with first producing this clip assembly, focusing before clip assembly is ready, and then assembling that with the press board and rivets to create the clipboard. So and in this case, one can see these levels 0, 1, and 2 as indicated in the multi-level indented bill of material. You can see exactly how the level 2, which are these 4 items right here, these go together to create the clip assembly. And the clip assembly, rivet, and press board are assembled together to create the clipboard. So in this case, it's indicated in terms of what are the unit of measure, each or dozen or a box, whatever it may be, and the quantities needed. So everything is quantity 1 except for rivets, which are 2 quantities. Another example, just to illustrate things, you can see bill of material is a list of components and quantities needed to make products. Provide product structure tree. Parent items are items above a given level. So in this case, A is awesome speaker that you have, the awesome brand speaker. And in this case, it requires 2 Bs, which is the speaker kits, and 3 of Cs, which are a standard speaker kit with amp booster. So that's how you end up creating 1 speaker unit. And in this case, what we really need is the lower level coding. And the lower level coding is indicated right here. Even though you have this branch that is B requires 2 units, each B requires 2 units of D and 2 units of E, they are not being indicated on the same level, because what you need to do is make sure all the B's occur at the lowest possible level. Since this D cannot be moved over here, we need to move this D down without really altering the branch composition, but just so that you can, for planning purposes, we'll make sure we plan the D and G first at level 3, then we move on to E's and F's at level 2, then B and C at level 1, and then finally A at level 0. So that's in terms of actual production. In terms of planning, you start with A, create an MRP plan for A first, then you move on to B and C, and then after that you do E and F planning, And then finally, you create a MR, material requirement plan, for D and G. So that's the concept of lower level coding in this case. And in this case, now let's look at the example of exactly how many items are needed. So assuming, we need 50 finished speaker sets of Awesome A model of speakers. So in this case, for 50 units that are required by the customer, if you look at, for each A, you need 2 of B. And so 2 times number of A, 2 times 50 is 100. And for each A, you require 3 Cs. So Cs are being calculated as 3 times number of A, which is 3 times 50, that's 150. The next we are going to calculate is the level 2 items, which are E and F. So E and F are indicated over here. So part E is calculated at, in this case, you're looking at 2 different areas where you need E. One is for each B required 2 E's, and for each C you require 2 E's. So in this case, 2 times number of B is 2 times 100. That is indicated over here. This is the B's. So 2 times 100 is 200. The second is plus 2 times number of C, which is 2 times 150, which is 200 plus 300 is 500. So that is the number of E's required altogether. Then F is the second item that is indicated in level 2. So F is strictly, only occurs one place, which is right here, and that is for each C you need 2 F's. So part F is 2 times the number of C, which is 2 times 150, that's 300. And then now we finally come to level 3 based on our lower level coding, and we are coming to D. And D is, the association is for each B you require 2 D's, and the second occurrence of D is on this end, which is for each F you require 2 D's. So you have 2 different areas where D is needed, and in this case, first one is 2 times number of B, which is 2 times 100, and then 2 times number of F's. So F we already indicated was 300. 2 times 300 is 600 plus 200 is 800. That is the number for number of 12-inch speakers that you need, which will go into creating 50 overall speaker units. And then part G is only the amp booster is needed only on this end, and that is for each F you need 1 G. So 1 times number of F. So since F we calculated earlier as 300, 1 times 300 is 300. So that actually ends up giving you the specific number of parts and sub-assemblies that you'll end up either buying as raw material or assembling it as part of sub-assembly. So you can see total number of B's that will be assembled in the process of making 50 A's is 100. The C's that will be assembled will be 150. E's that we'll need altogether, which is the backing boxes for all these, we'll need 500 of these. And then 2 for part F, which is standard 12-inch boosters assemblies you need is 300. And then part D, which is 12-inch speakers altogether, you need 800. And then part G, which is the amp boosters you need, is a total of 300. So that actually allows you to tell you how much is needed, and what is needed and how much is needed is being answered in this example. Now let's move on to looking into the example of when is it needed. So one can easily go back and create a time-phased product structure tree where if we are given how much time does it take, lead time does it take to produce or assemble or to source it from a supplier, we can start from when is it needed. If the customer says you have 8 weeks to go, you put that line over here, or you can put 0 over here and go -1, -2, -3, or you can say, okay, in this case, this is the time when the final finished good item is needed, And these represent each period, and we can easily number them later on. And then one can start looking at exactly how much time. So if it takes 1 week to assemble A, once you have all the ingredients B and C available to you, then we can put that line and then create. So if you turn this around 90 degrees, you'll see is the same product structure tree. But now these lines are indicated by how long it takes to produce a certain item. So it takes 2 weeks to produce B, whereas it takes 1 week to produce C. It takes 2 weeks to source E in this case, whereas it takes 1 week to source D. 3 weeks to produce, subassemble F, and so on and so forth. So the earliest you need, if you start in week 1, you need to have 7 more weeks to make sure you deliver everything by week 8. So that's a way of figuring out when anything is needed. So one can easily see production of D has to be started, certain amount of Ds are started at week 4, plus some of them are needed at week 2. So you can easily plan it out in a different way to make either all of them at once if the inventory carrying cost is insignificant, or you can separate them by how many are needed and separately when they are needed. Now, in terms of specialized bill of material, we also have in industry what is known as phantom bills, which are for transient sub-assemblies which are just in transit. They are in transient stage. They are not actually meaningful, but they are the in-process stages before it finally metamorphizes versus happens to this final stage. So they are actually never stocked in that scenario, but so these are just almost like a fictitious bill that one is created. They are never stocked in that, immediately consumed in the next stage. So something that is created but is directly consumed to produce a different subassembly. K-bills are basically all the miscellaneous items, group small loose parts under pseudo item number, all put together as just like a miscellaneous account or petty cash equivalent in accounting. There's a K-bill which takes into account all the loose parts which basically are C items, but that they don't have to really be specifically monitored as individual items in that case. Other variations of that are modular bill, which is product assembled from major sub-assemblies for customer options. A key example will be the computer industry like laptops, etc., where the choices of video screens or the operating systems are pretty well defined into separate modules, 2 or 3 options that are available to the customer. So they can easily mix and match and create their own particular unique laptop in this case. Same thing with fast food industry with value meal number 1 or 2. The options of remain very little in terms of what can be added or what can be subtracted. And so that's where modular bills will become very handy. So in this case, product assembled from major sub-assemblies or customer options. Modular bill keep for each major sub-assembly, simplify forecasting and planning. So in this case, you can see, as we mentioned in the previous discussions of Honda versus Ford vehicles, when you keep the configurations lower, it makes it a lot easier. So in order to, you have 26 modular bills that can allow for almost 2,300 various configurations of a product in this case. So one can easily see for an automobile type of engines, type of colors, type of interior, choice of interior, whether it's leather, tweed, or plush, or interior colors, body, just to name a few in this fictitious model. It allows for some many configurations on the case of the customer. Now, in terms of time phase bills that we mentioned earlier, we have, I think I'll give you another example of that. You can see in the clipboard example, this is similar to the one we just mentioned earlier, but in the clipboard example, on a time scale, you can see exactly how much time will it take to assemble the clipboard once you have the press board, clip assembly, and rivets available. And in order to create the clip assembly, which takes one time period, you need all the other items which take another time period to source. So that will be a simplistic example. So in this case, forward scheduling is start at today's day and schedule forward to determine the earliest date the job can be finished. And if each item takes 1 period to complete, the clipboard can be finished in 3 periods as an example. Whereas backward scheduling is start at the due date and work your way backwards in this case. Now, in terms of item master file, this is the example of how it appears in the work shop floor. Item is press board. What is the item number or SKU number? Item type is purchased item. Its sales category is composite. Value is ABC item. It's a B item in this case. Who is the particular person within the purchasing department who is responsible for buying it? Where exactly in the computer the vendor drawing is located? Is it a phantom code or not? We mentioned earlier about the phantom bill. No, it's not. Unit price is given to you. So in terms of price or divided by cost, which gives you the margin associated. Pegging is yes. Lower level code was 1. And then lead time is also given to you in 1 week or 1 period. Annual demand is indicated, holding cost, ordering setup cost, safety stock, reorder point. All those information is given to you. EOQ is also calculated. Minimum order quantity, maximum order quantity, multiple order quantities 1, policy code. Again, so that is the type of information that is provided. Now, from item master file, you can easily go further into the computer database of the company and look into exactly how much is the physical inventory. On-hand inventory is given to you as 150. Where exactly in the warehouse this item is located, in which bin, if you will. On order, how many items are already on order, and as the supplier would say, it's in the mail. Allocated, cycle-wise, when is the purchasing cycle scheduled? Last count was done on September 5th. The difference was -2 from physical inventory from what is on the computer. And again, in terms of usage sale, you can see year-to-date, month-to-date, year-to-date receipt, month-to-date receipt, all that information which allows one to make meaningful decisions regarding MRP. So cost accounting codes, routing, engineering code are given to you. So those pretty much give you a glimpse of how things are actually visualized in the actual shop floor. Now, in terms of MRP process, this is where now, with this information, we try to explode, which is expand basically the bill of material into looking into, you have this final clipboard, but what are the demand and production needs on various parts that you, and then netting out the inventory, which is a process of subtracting on-hand inventory from scheduled receipts and figuring out what is the net requirements once based on the gross requirements that were already indicated from customer demand. And lot sizing is determine the quantity in which items are usually made. Are we going to make it based on economic order quantity, buy certain units per period, or use some other rule? And time phasing requirements can be listed. So in this particular case, you have the MRP matrix is, this is how typically items will be listed in an MRP chart, where is item number, what is the lot size, lower level code is indicated lead time from the supplier or assembly lead time, and then over a certain periods that is being planned. And you need to have this type of data. You need the gross requirements, scheduled receipt, and projected on hand. That is the inputs that are needed in here. And based on that, you calculate net requirements, planned order receipts, and planned order releases. So those are the information that one ends up calculating. Gross requirements are derived from master production schedule or planned order releases of the parent item. That is indicating how many units are demanded and at what time period. Scheduled receipts are things that are being scheduled to be received from vendors, outside vendors, or from the supplier, so that you can add that to or subtract that from the net requirement and calculate the subtract that from the gross requirement to calculate the net requirement. So in this case, use that. It's a gross requirement of inventory and scheduled receipt. And here, after that, once we figure out we still have some outstanding demand, that's when we need to receive certain orders which are being manufactured to cater to that demand. And then after adjusting for lead time, which is indicated over there, we schedule as to when to release that order so that we can receive it at the right time. So here is an example of master production schedule. So you have yourself a clipboard, and the master production schedule of clipboard is indicated to be 85, 95, 120, 100, 100. So those are the 5-period production schedule that is indicated. For lap desk, it's 60 units every 2 weeks. So in this case, on hand, you have 25 clipboards, and then on order is 175, which is scheduled receipt in period 1. Lap desk is 20, press board is 150. So those are all the information that is provided to you. Lower level coding, these are the finished good items, whereas press board is level 1 item which goes into manufacture of clipboard. And lot size is basically lot for lot, multiples of 50, and minimum quantity that has to be purchased is 100. Lead time in each case is 1 period. So in this particular case, you can see the product structure record is clipboard requires 1 press board, 1 clip assembly, and 2 rivets. So that's a level 0 and level 1. So the clipboard is an actual finished good item, whereas laptop desk is a completely different finished good final product, and that requires 2 press boards, 3 trims, 1 bean bag, and 4 ounces of glue. That is to make a lap desk. Completely different product. So now going back and focusing on the clipboard itself, if the lower level coding is 0, in this case, what we're looking at is lot for lot size. That is, we actually end up buying what exactly is the items demanded. That's the order we will place, just like a just-in-time environment. So in this case, you have the projected on hand is 25, and then 175 is the schedule received in period 1, which was indicated in the previous slide. So, and the gross requirements are given to you. So in this case, you can see the 85 units that are demanded, you already have 25 in the bank or in the warehouse, minus the 85. So you still will have some projected inventory, which is about, in this case, 200 minus 85, that's 115 will go here. So if you still have positive inventory, your net requirement is 0 over here. And then that 115 minus 95 will still give you projected inventory of 20, net requirement is 0. So that 20 over here minus 120, that's a negative 100, and that's where the net requirement of 100 comes in. And that's when we'll start planning. And as can be seen over here, this is the first, first iteration. So from MRP 1, now what we are doing is in period 1, we end up looking at 25 plus 175, which is 200 minus 85. 200 minus 85 is, so in this case, 25 plus 175 is 200 units available. And from these 200, you subtract the 85, that gives you 115 in hand at the end of period 1. So net requirement is 0 because you don't need to make any more given the fact that you already have 115 still remaining at the end of period 1. Now moving on further to period 2, you can see 115 minus 95 will give you projected on hand of 20, and that will be 0 again over here, as will be indicated in the next slide. As I mentioned over here, you have 115 units available, and then to calculate net requirement, 115 minus 85 is 20 units. Then moving further along, now we are looking at this one over here. Projected on hand is 20 in end of period 2, and the demand, gross requirement is 120. So 20 minus 120 is negative 100 inventory. Since you can't have negative inventory, your net requirement is 100. That means as a material requirement planner, I better plan on receiving 100 units of clipboards by this time period. And since the lead time is 1 unit, that means I better release the order by week 2 so that I end up receiving it in week 3 to satisfy this additional demand. And I'm only ordering 100. Why? Because of lot for lot. Lot for lot means ordering exactly what is needed. If I only require 1, that's exactly what I'll be ordering. And then moving on to the next time period, you can see the next, since we did a lot for lot, we end up with 0 inventory. And after that, net requirements are exactly as the gross requirement. So 100 items, 100s are needed. 100 will be, we plan on receiving it, which means 100 has to be placed, order has to be placed a week before that, release that order over here. Same thing, this 100 will satisfy this over here. Net on-hand inventory is 0 again. Then this 100 will be the net requirement. The gross requirement becomes a net requirement, which means we better plan on receiving 100 units over here. That means we need to, in period 5, which means we need to release the order for period 5 in period 4. Okay? So that is the how one calculates MRP chart. Now, in terms of lap desk, which has a completely different product, and in this case, in the previous slide, I mentioned the gross requirement was 60 units every other period. That's 60 and 60. In this case, you have projected on hand was given to be at 20. In this case, lot size is multiples of 50. That is, we can only order 50 units or 100 units, 150, 200. That's the possibilities, options available to us in terms of ordering the product. In terms of, so let's go ahead and calculate. Since this is 220, in period 1 there is no gross requirement. That projected on hand remains the same over here, and then so you'll have a 20 over here, and then 20 minus 60 will give you negative 40, and that's where the net requirement of 40 will come in, which will trigger an order release. And that's exactly how the information happens over here. You can see 20 with a gross requirement of 0 will give you still the 20 projected on hand. Net requirement is 0, so we don't have to do any planning of new orders over here. Then next time, the gross requirement is 60. Out of that, 20 can be taken care of. And so you're left with minus 40. That means net requirement is 40. But whenever we place an order, we have to have orders in multiples of 50. That means 50 will be placed, 50 units will be, order will be, we plan on receiving it in period 2, which means we release that order in period 1. If we get 50 over here, 50 plus 20 is 70. 70 minus 60, then we need to revise the projected on hand to coming to 10. Because we actually ended up ordering 50 additional than what is the net requirement. So we end up having positive inventory as a result. So in this case, we have 10 units which move to the next period. Since there is no additional gross requirement, you're looking at the same 10 units moving further. And that 10 units, when faced with a gross requirement of 60, will trigger, give you the net requirement of 50. And that 50 has to be, we plan on receiving, since that is exactly the multiple of 50, we plan on receiving that 50 over here in period 4, which requires a release of order of 50 units in period 3. And that takes care of the necessary demand, and we are done over here. So we can figure out, complete the MRP chart over here. Now, given this, these are just the lower level code is 0. These are the finished goods. Now, based on this, we need to also calculate what the parts are needed. So here are the parts that are for the clipboard. So you're looking at clipboards are needed in 2 different locations. One is for the clipboard, you're looking at planned order releases. Let me just go back and show you that information. Here we go. So you can see planned order releases for clipboard is given to you. So that's the clipboard up here. And then planned order releases, 100 units in period 2, 100 units in period 3, and 100 units in period 4. And then for lab desk, we need to have planned order releases of 50 in period 1 and 50 in period 3. So keep that in mind, and that becomes the input in terms of gross requirements that are coming in. So you have the planned order releases. That's the same information that I just explained. Those are the 2 things that are affecting what the gross requirement is going to be for the press board, because we need to release the order to start assembling clipboards and lap desks. So we need to have all the ingredients ready. That's the dependent demand environment where that triggers the gross requirement, specific gross requirements for press board, which is needed in 2 different areas. So in this case, you have a total of 100 clipboards needed in period 2, 3, 4, and 50 lab desks needed in period 1 and 3. Now, in this particular case, you can see you also are given from the original input, the lot size for press board is minimum of 100 units. Projected on hand is 150, that's already in the warehouse, and lead time is 1 period. Now, given this information, let's look at how many press boards are needed. So for each clipboard, we need 1 press board. So that part is pretty straightforward. So 100 units in period 2, 3, 4 will amount to 100 units going in periods 2, 3, and 4. But for each lab desk, we need 2 press boards. So this 50 and this 50 over here in period 1 and period 3 has to be multiplied by 2. So you can see this 50 times 2 is 100, which is the gross requirement for the press board coming from the lab desk. And this 50 translates in times 2 is 100. So 100, which is multiplied by 1, is 100, plus this 50 times 2 is 100. That's a total of 200. So that's the put together. This is the new gross requirement for the press board, and now we can go ahead and calculate our MRP chart in this case. So let's go ahead, given this information, so you can see projected on hand is 150, and this is 100. So you will be left with, remaining will be still 50, and net requirement becomes 0, and then 50 minus 100 is minus 50. That's where you have a net requirement of 50, which will trigger an order in period 2. So let's look at it, how this turns out. And this is the 150 minus 100 gives you 50, as I mentioned earlier. This 50 minus 100 is negative 50, which becomes a net requirement of 50. Now, since we can only order minimum of 100, so even if 50 is required, we have to order 100. So we plan on receiving 100 over here. That means we need to release the order a week, 1 period before. So that 100 plus the 50 over here, that's total of 150. Minus 100 leaves us with the revised projected on hand of 50. Okay. So next, this 50 minus 200 gives you negative 150, which in this case becomes the net requirement of 150. Since it's greater, 150 is greater than 100 minimum, so we order exactly, we plan on receiving those 150 items over here. So 150, order for 150, if we need to receive it in period 3, you need to release that order in period 2, and then you are left with projected on hand of 0. So now you have gross requirement of 100. That means net requirement of 100. We plan on receiving 100 in period 4, which means release the order of 100 in period 3. So that's pretty much how that information is moved forward. We can figure out now, given the planned order report, which is it tells you we plan on, what we plan on ordering is 100 units of clipboards in period, releasing the order for 100 units of clipboards in period 2, 3, and 4, 50 units of lap desk in period 1 and 3, which translates into the release of order for 100 units of press board in period 1, 150 press boards in period 2, and 100 units in period 3. So that pretty much explains the different, how the MRP shows up and the planned order reports that will come out. So in case of lot sizing in MRP systems, as I showed you briefly, you could have a lot for lot ordering policy, which is ordering exactly what's needed, no more, no less. Whereas other scenarios are fixed lot size lot policies, minimum order quantity, like I showed you for press board, minimum of 100, or maximum order quantities. If maximum is only 100 and you need more than 100, you need to split it in 2 periods. Multiple order quantities, multiples of 50 that I showed you for lap desk example. Economic order quantity can also be used, and periodic order quantity every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, whatever can be calculated. So let's kind of show some examples of how different lot sizing rules can be taken into place. So in this case, you have, let's say, for lot scenario. So in this case, you have the gross requirements that are given to you as 30, 50, 20, 10, and 40. So in this case, ordering cost is 60, carrying cost is 1, and average period demand is, when you take these 5 periods, average them by 5, and you come up with 30. So in this case, what we are saying is average demand is 30, and in this particular scenario, if you do a lot for lot, which given the projected on hand is 30, 30 minus 30 is 0, nothing required over here. Then next is 50, that becomes a gross requirement, becomes a net requirement. And in this case, planned order receipt in period 2 is 50 since lot for lot, and that becomes a planned order release in period 1. And moving on, so now you'll notice once you have a lot for lot, once the inventory projected on becomes 0, it stays 0 because we order exactly what is needed. So this 20 of gross requirement becomes 20 net requirement, which means 20 planned order receipt for period 3, which translate into order release of period before that. So this 10 translates into the net requirement of 10 in period 4, which translates into receiving this, planning on receiving the order, 10 units of order in period 4, which means releasing in the same number of units in period 3. Same thing, 40, 40, 40, 40, that is being translated. So in this case, one can easily calculate the total cost for lot, which is 4 times 60 ordering costs. We order 4 different times in period 1, 2, 3, 4, and each time we pay $60 plus, since we are not carrying any inventory cost, 0 times the $1. So the altogether is we are paying is $240. Compare that with the economic order quantity. So when one can easily calculate using the same numbers that you had daily demand information. The daily demand is per period demand was 30, and ordering cost is 60, and the carrying cost is 1. So you can easily calculate the economic order quantity to be 60 units, and that becomes a minimum order quantity. So in that case, using the same gross requirements, you can use, now the only thing changing in here is the EOQ of 60 instead of lot for lot. So you have the projected on hand of 30 units. So over here there is 0 net requirement. then moving on to 50, and that 50 translates into the net requirement since we have 0 on hand, but we order minimum order size of 60 because of the economic order quantity. So that gives us a projected on hand of 10 units, and that 60, if we plan to receive the order of 60 in period 2, you plan on releasing it a week before. Then moving on over here, this 10 minus 20 will give you minus 10, which means net requirement of 10. But even net requirement of 10, you will plan on actually plan on receiving an order of 60 units because of EOQ, which means release the order of 60 units a week before in period 2, so that you can receive it in period 3. And then, so that 60 minus 10 will give you the 50 projected on hand. And then next period, out of this 50, you consume 10 in the gross requirement. You're left with 40, and that 40 is used up in the final period. So in this case, notice that we order only 2 times. That is total of 2 times $60 of the carrying cost. And in terms of how much is the carrying cost, you have 10 units over here, 50 units over here, and 40 units over here. Altogether, that's 100 units times 1 is $100. So 120 plus 100 is 220 is the economic order quantity cost. Now compare that with the periodic order quantity, the last variation. And in this case, you can see periodic order quantity is the number of orders that you need to get. In this case, you have economic order quantity, which we calculated in the EOQ formula. That was 60 divided by daily demand or periodic demand of 30. So 60 divided by 30 is 2 periods. So we need to carry 2 periods worth of requirements every time we place an order. So in this case, notice that same exact MRP for the same rod, except for lot size is now POQ of 2. So you have projected on hand 30 going in here, no net requirements. Moving forward, you have a gross requirement of 50, and in this case projected, that is the net requirement of 50. Now this net requirement of 50 plus the gross requirement of 20 put together, since we can order, anytime we place an order, we need to order for 2 periods worth of requirement. So 50 plus 20 is 70. So we order 70 units, that 70 will be, if we plan on receiving it in period 2, we need to release it in period 1. So in this case, we'll end up, since we ordered 70, but we only needed 50 units, we are looking at 20 units projected on hand, which will take care of the gross requirements of period 3, so that this order of 70 takes care of 2 periods, as was decreed by POQ of 2. So now there is no order again in here, and then for the period 4, you have 10 units, but 10 units becomes a net requirement, but plus the 40 gross requirement for the following period, total of 50, that becomes the orders we plan on receiving in period 4, which means order released in period 3 is 50. Once you have this, 50 net requirement in period 4 was 10. That means we have projected on hand of 40, which is consumed in period 5. So you are looking at 2 orders. So 2 times 60, that's the total ordering cost, plus 20 plus 40 is the carrying cost. 40 times 1 is 60. So 120 plus 60 is 180. Moving on, this is exactly how an example of how a planned order report will look like. I already showed you how the calculations come from, but you can see exactly in industry, it'll be indicated by what is on hand, what is on order, allocated, etc., and what are the gross requirements based on the various dates and order numbers, scheduled receipts, and projected on hands that indicate action needed, whether it's to be expedited or release a new purchase order. So those basically are coming from the MRP chart. So this is an example of an actual planned order report that will be generated. so that the material requirement planner can act on it and accordingly revise or input the new order for dependent demand items. MRP action report is another type of report which on a particular day you can see exactly which type of items were part of a certain order, when the order is expected to arrive, what are the quantities, what are the actions, expediting, move forward, move backward, etc., release it or de-expedite as the case may be, so that we actually revise things based on what are needed. And now next we move on to the discussion of capacity requirement planning, which is to match capacity of the machines and the workers based on what the needs are for production. So in this case, what we end up doing is create a load profile on various machines based on what the orders are coming in. Identify underloads and overloads of machines. So based on what is required, one can easily see what is needed, and if the machine is going to be overused or it still has extra capacity left. So based on this, the inputs are planned order releases that are coming from MRP, routing files, and open order files that you have. So if you think about CRP, you have the MRP planned order releases, which is one of the input is the MRP from the MRP chart, planned order releases, the last row, that information is coming in here. Also the routing file as to what products get made on what machines, and the open orders that are already in place. That is something which is has reserved certain capacity of the machine. So based on that, you can easily figure out the load profile for each process. So in this case, calculating the capacity, capacity is the maximum capability to produce, and it is based on the rated capacity, which is the theoretical output that can be attained in a process, the maximum possible capacity of a production process if it were operating at full speed without any interruption or constraints, exceptions or downtime. So this is a theoretical environment. Theoretical maximum will be the rated capacity. But effective capacity takes into account efficiency or particular product and the utilization based on number of hours available to produce the product, etc., using normal conditions. So effective daily capacity is number of machines or workers times hours available per shift times number of shifts times utilization rate. So not every machine is utilized 100% of the time. So it could be less than 100%, and that's the factor that, plus the efficiency of the machine. It may not be generating, the yield may be slightly less than 100%, so that has to be factored in. So in this case, calculating the capacity, you have the utilization, which is percentage of available times spent working. There is some time spent on setting up the machine or maintenance, etc. So that is taking out a certain percentage from utilization. Efficiency, how well the machine performs compared to standard output level. Some machines, as they get older, may have a lot more issues to be dealt with, so their efficiency is not as good as the newer machines or machines that are working well. Load, standard hours of work assigned to a facility, and load percent is the ratio of load to capacity in this case. So load percent is load divided by capacity times 100%. So in this case, load profile is a graphical comparison of load versus capacity. How much is the capacity and how much is actually how much of the capacity is actually being used or loaded on the machine, and that is being reserved for a particular production process. So leveling underloaded conditions, so acquire more work. So if you have a machine that is under capacity, which is still has some capacity to spare, in that case you need to allocate some more work to that machine and balance it out. Pull work ahead of scheduled for a later time period and reduce normal capacity if everything else doesn't work. Load leveling is process of balancing underloads and overloads that we do. In case of reducing overload conditions, eliminate unnecessary requirements. Make sure you're not creating some unnecessary requirements and thereby overloading the machine. Reroute jobs to alternative machines. Find alternative substitutes available to that machine, workers or work centers. Split lots between 2 or more machines, so that way they can spread the work needed, and increase normal capacity, see if we can get into a more efficient machine or higher capacity machine, if you will. Subcontract the additional work, increase efficiency of operation, maybe use a more seasoned worker who can produce more with less quality defects compared to a rookie, which is actually producing lesser yield. Push work back to later time periods, back ordering, if you will, and revise master schedule accordingly. In terms of a copy example of a copy courier, 2 high-speed copy couriers that can be operated by one operator. You have 2 shifts per day, 8 hours per shift, and 5 days a week. No breaks during the day are assumed in this case, 30 minutes for lunch or dinner, and machine service time is 30 minutes at the beginning of each shift. So machine efficiency is also provided to you at 90%. So in this case, you have capacity of 2 copiers times 2 shifts, as I mentioned earlier, times 8 hours a day, and in this case, 90% utilization, so 7/8 utilization in this case. So you have, 90% efficiency, and utilization is because of the fact that you're using 30 minutes for lunch and dinner, 7/8 utilization is being taken into account. And given this, that gives you a total of 1,512 minutes per day. And in this case, you can see there are 5 different jobs. The number of copies that need to be made are for each of these jobs are indicated in the second column respectively. Set of times needed to set up these jobs is also indicated in the third column. In run time, how much time per unit will it take for the copy job. Some jobs are more complex than others. Then load calculations. In this case, you can easily see if the entire job 10 is done all at once. You can see you have to spend 5.2 minutes to set it up, plus 500 copies, each at 8.08 minutes per copy. So that gives you a total job time of 45 minutes and 20 seconds. Similar calculations for remaining 4 additional jobs. Altogether, you're looking at 1,615.7 minutes. So that is more than what we actually have. So in this case, you're looking at, as we calculated earlier, you had 1,512 minutes a day, but load percentage is, since we need is 1615.7 divided by 1512, that's in terms of calculation, is 1.068 times 100%, that's 106.8%. That's overloaded by 6.8%. So extend working day by approximately 36 minutes by giving maybe overtime. So in that case, when you extend that working day by that much minutes, your load percentage, and load percent is 99%, and increase efficiency to 97%. So in that case, you can see initial load profile under normal capacity at 40 hours of capacity. You're looking at time per week, certain days of the week when you are overloaded, and certain days of the week when you are underloaded. And in this case, what we are doing is adjust load profile. So in this case, the third day of the week, you can work an extra shift, put overtime over here, and remove this much chunk into, make it in advance, and then this much chunk can be pushed later, and the remaining chunk can be done over here. So that gives an example of how we can stay within the normal capacity cases. In terms of relaxing MRP assumptions, material is not always the most constraining resource. Sometimes it's the workers or the machines or other factors, other resources that you have. So then one has to take that into account. Lead times can vary, and not every transaction needs to be recorded. As we mentioned in terms of K-bill, there are a lot of things that can all be aggregated into miscellaneous parts and nuts and bolts that don't need to be recorded and time spent on it. Shop floor may require more sophisticated scheduling system, and scheduling in advance may be, not be appropriate for on-demand production. So now let's look at the remainder of the topics of resource planning, and one of them is enterprise resource planning. ERP systems, as the common options available are SAP or Oracle or BAN that are available through industry, various companies. But these are software that organize and manage the company business processes, and we have discussed them in various capacities in our earlier discussions on operation management topics. What they try to do is allow for sharing information across functional areas, integrating business processes, and facilitating customer interaction, providing benefit to global companies, especially where there are a lot of virtual project management being done. So in terms of organizational data flow, you can see there is a variety of information that needs to go back and forth among various entities, various functional areas, as well as a company's external as well as internal stakeholders. So you see between customers and sales and marketing, there's an exchange of customer orders and order status. Between marketing, sales and marketing and production material management, you're looking at forecast customer orders and cost and time estimates that are being provided. Now in terms of raw material and component orders versus availability and delivery issues that are coming in between suppliers and production side. And then finance and accounting will look into interaction with production, is production plan, material inventory, and cost profitability issues. Sales data has to be delivered from marketing to finance and accounting. And in terms of hiring, training personnel that we mentioned in aggregate planning topic, and legal requirement, job candidate training schedule, all that is going between sales and marketing. And then payroll, benefits, etc. Those are the issues between HR and finance and accounting. So those are a variety of data that flows to and forth among various function areas and external stakeholders of a company. Central database, you have the ERP data repository, the database which has a lot of the data of the relating to company, and depending on which functional area you belong to, you will have access to that portion of the data, so you can different functional areas can accomplish their tasks, whether it's sales and marketing, finance and accounting, production, human resources, etc. And in this case, there are several vendors. I have named several of these just a few minutes ago. SAP, Oracle, then I2 is another one for supply chain management, etc. So, and this list keeps changing depending on who are the new industry players that come into play. ERP implementation, analyze business processes. One has to choose modules to implement, and which processes have the biggest impact on customer relations. For example, in today's day and age, one of the biggest area that is in favor, maximum amount of job demands are in area of analytics. So data mining is a big thing when it comes to ERP repositories. So that's another skill set that students ought to consider acquiring before graduating in this area. So which process would benefit more from integration? Which process should be standardized versus delegated? Align level of sophistication, finalize delivery and access, and link with external partners. In terms of customer relationship management, it is a software that plans and execute business processes, involve customer interaction, changes focus on managing product and managing customer. So from managing a product, now you're focusing on managing customer incidents. Analyze points of sale data for patterns used to predict future behavior as to how many people end up returning the items, how many people have complaints about a product, how many people are satisfied. So that type of data can be integrated for meaningful product decisions later on. So from a supply chain point of view, you're looking at software that plans and execute business processes related to supply chain. It includes supply chain planning, supply chain execution, and supplier relationship management. As one example of industry software that is available is I2, which allows considerable supply chain management options. Distinction between ERP and SCM are becoming increasingly blurred, so they are being merged all as one. integrated within the ERP systems. And another aspect of this one is product lifecycle management, software that incorporates new product design and development and product lifecycle management into the whole mix, integrate customer and suppliers in the design process through entire product lifecycle. So one can easily see how a variety of stakeholders, whether it's a R&D, research and development of a company, product design area, in terms of customers, manufacturing and delivery, and supplier, they can really work together to reduce the time to market and use ERP systems to deliver what are the right values, perceived values for the customer in this case. And finally, connectivity. Application programming interfaces are used in this case, give other programs well-defined way of speaking or interacting, communicating. Enterprise application integration solutions are also there. Then EDI is being replaced by XML, the markup language, business language of internet. And service-oriented architecture, collection of services that communicate with each other within software and between software are used. And all these tools and techniques and software go a long way in actually getting the resources planned for the companies. Thank you. And we'll see you at a future discussion of another operations management topic.